A fire consumes flesh in seconds, but fear, humiliation and despair, those burn far longer. Most people know how Joan of Arc died. They picture the flames, the smoke, a young woman bound to a stake, consumed in public spectacle as cries of heretic echo off the stone walls of Rouen marketplace. But what they don't picture, what we are rarely asked to imagine, is what happened before the fire. There was the silence before the flames, there were shackles, and before the crowd gathered to watch her die, she was already being dismantled. Slowly, deliberately and with chilling precision, Joan's execution is often remembered as a moment of religious injustice, a brave girl burned by men who feared what they couldn't control. But the truth is more grotesque. She wasn't simply condemned, she was broken, not just by the English crown or the church, but by a justice system engineered to erase her dignity. One humiliating moment at a time. What if death wasn't the worst thing that happened to her? What if the real horror wasn't the fire that ended her life, but the slow motion psychological torture that preceded it? What if the flames were just the final punctuation in a sentence written in intimidation, violation, spiritual deprivation and calculated fear? Joan of Arc was 19 years old, and by the time the kindling was lit beneath her bare feet, she had endured a campaign of systemic degradation that today would meet every definition of state-sanctioned torture. She wasn't tried in good faith, she wasn't protected as a prisoner, she was a teenage girl shackled to her bed at night, denied basic religious rights, interrogated without rest, threatened with instruments of torture, and sexually terrorized by guards who saw her not as a prophet, not as a woman, but as property. The official accounts call it a trial. History books often label it heresy, but peel away the rhetoric and what remains is simple. This was the ritualized destruction of a young woman who had dared to disobey power. What you're about to hear is not the myth of Joan of Arc, Saint of France. It is not the sanitized version sung in hymns or taught in Sunday schools. This is the part we're not supposed to remember, the forgotten torture before the flames. She is called the Maid of Orleans, a visionary, a saint, a warrior girl who changed the fate of a kingdom, and when her end is spoken of, it's often with a certain tragic reverence. Joan of Arc burned at the stake for heresy, a martyr, a misunderstood hero, but even that sanitized narrative carries with it a distortion because it makes her death seem noble, even clean. In truth, nothing about her final year of life was noble. Nothing was clean, and the only thing misunderstood is how deeply she suffered. The story we are taught goes something like this: Joan, guided by divine visions, leads the French army to victory. She crowns a king, she defies the odds, but she is captured by the English, falsely tried for heresy and executed in a grotesque act of political vengeance. That version isn't entirely wrong, but it's woefully incomplete because what that story glosses over, what most textbooks skip, is what happened between the moment of her capture and the day her body turned to ash. Nearly a full year passed between those two events, and in that time Joan of Arc endured something far more insidious than just imprisonment. She endured systematic, soul-destroying psychological torture. This wasn't a trial, it was an orchestrated demolition, a coordinated effort not just to kill Joan but to discredit her, humiliate her and erase her memory in the eyes of God and man, to break her so thoroughly that by the time she reached the scaffold she would already be unrecognizable, not just physically but spiritually. What makes Joan's story Particularly disturbing is that none of this was accidental. Her jailers, interrogators and judges knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't just want her dead, they wanted her discredited. They needed her to collapse, to beg, to recant, to wear a dress, to be unmade. They wanted the girl who claimed to speak with saints to be reduced to something utterly human, something frightened, vulnerable and broken, because if they could do that, if they could turn Joan into a heretic, a liar, a gender deviant, they wouldn't just kill a girl. They would destroy a symbol, and that, more than anything else, is why her suffering matters. You see, Joan was dangerous not because she wielded a sword, but because she refused to follow the script. She was a teenage peasant girl who wore men's armor, who dared speak to kings without asking permission, who heard voices and believed they came from heaven, and who led men into battle, not with brute force but with conviction. To her enemies that wasn't just heresy, it was insubordination. And in 15th century Europe, insubordinate women didn't get trials, they got spectacles. What followed her capture in 1430 was one of the most infamous judicial farces in medieval history. She was arrested by the Burgundians, allies of the English, sold like property, and handed over to an occupying force who already knew the verdict. There was never a chance at acquittal, there was never a path to mercy, because Joan had embarrassed powerful men, she had outshone nobles, and worst of all, she had done it as a woman. That's why this story can't just be about the flames. That's why it's not enough to say Joan was burned, because before she burned she was lied to, threatened, starved, mocked, interrogated, betrayed, and left completely alone in a system designed to collapse her from the inside. And though the fire consumed her body, the truth is, it was the months of isolation, terror, and betrayal that killed her long before the flames did. This is not the Joan of whitewash sainthood. This is not the golden girl on horseback. This is Joan in chains, Joan in the dark, Joan questioning whether the voices were ever real or just madness brought on by suffering. This is the forgotten Joan, the one who was broken before she burned. The beginning of Joan's end didn't start at the stake. It began with a betrayal on May 23, 1430. Joan of Arc was pulled from her horse outside the city of Campine. She had led a sortie to defend the town, but the gates closed before she could re-enter. Captured by Burgundian forces, she was turned over not as a prisoner of war but as a political prize. To the English, Joan wasn't a warrior, she was a threat to empire. Wrapped in the skin of a peasant girl, they bought her for 10,000 libras, a king's ransom for a teenage girl. They didn't buy her to interrogate her, they bought her to destroy her when she arrived in Rouen. Then, under English control, she didn't enter a royal chamber or a prison built for noble prisoners. She was not, as church law required, held in a convent under the supervision of nuns. Instead, she was thrown into a secular military prison guarded by 5 English soldiers, all male, all hostile, and all instructed to keep her chained and under watch night and day. The room she was held in was no cell of silence or contemplation. It was a fortified tower cell, damp with rot and thick with the stench of piss and old blood. The light came from a narrow slit of stone window, offering no view, only a blurred reminder that a world still existed beyond her punishment. She was chained to a wooden beam, her ankles shackled, her arms often bound. At night she was chained to her bed, a crude plank of wood nailed into the stone floor. She could not move freely, not to pace, not to kneel in prayer, not even to roll over while sleeping. Freedom of movement had been Replaced with rusted iron, freedom of dignity had been replaced with leering guards who made no secret of what they thought of her. Joan was not merely a prisoner, she was a trophy, and the men assigned to watch her behaved accordingly. Eyewitness records describe verbal abuse, constant jeering, and threats of rape on more than one occasion. Joan reported attempted assaults by the guards, begging her captors to let her be moved to a church-run prison or to be placed under the care of women. They refused. She was forced to wear male clothing, not as an act of defiance as the prosecution later claimed, but as a desperate form of protection. Her soldier's tunic and leggings bound tight with cords made it harder for the guards to access her body. But that act of self-defense would later be used against her as proof of heresy. This wasn't confinement, this was calculated degradation. She was isolated from everyone who had once protected her. No priest offered her regular confession. No allies were allowed to visit. She was cut off from her faith community and left alone with men who saw her as a mad woman, a fraud, or worse, a woman who had dared to lead men and win. And she was only 19. Every morning Joan woke in that freezing cell to the same question: would today be the day they tortured her, or burned her, or simply let her rot? It's important to understand this wasn't medieval chaos, it was intentional strategy. The English crown couldn't afford to execute a French national hero without first destroying her credibility. So they would start by destroying her sanity. Joan was denied basic religious comforts. The Eucharist was withheld. She was often barred from hearing Mass, and agony for a girl whose entire identity had been forged in devotion. This wasn't punishment, it was psychological warfare. And it worked. By the end of her first month in Rouen, Joan was hallucinating. She described seeing St. Catherine no longer in radiant glory but weeping, her voice muffled, distant. This wasn't heavenly revelation, this was the erosion of a mind pushed to the brink. Historical records, mostly from English sources, describe Joan as stubborn, wild, and uncontrollable, but what they really meant was that she hadn't yet collapsed. Because make no mistake, that was the goal. The conditions were designed not to hold Joan but to unmake her, to strip her of her identity, her confidence, her connection to God, to take a girl once sure of her divine mission and leave her questioning everything, her visions, her virtue, even her virginity. The war against Joan wasn't fought with swords. It was fought with moldy straw bedding, chained ankles, and men who whispered filth in the dark. And all of this was just the beginning, because after the iron and the isolation came something worse, the trial. And that's where the real torture began, not of the body but of the mind and soul. There's a specific kind of cruelty reserved for women who disobey power. For Joan of Arc, that cruelty took many forms: physical, psychological, and spiritual, but none of it was random, none of it was incidental. It was all rooted in one fundamental truth: the English couldn't stomach Joan was a girl, and she didn't act like one. She wore armor, she commanded men, she gave orders to nobles, bishops, and royalty. She swore she heard the voice of God, and people believed her. That was the true crime, not heresy, not sorcery, not cross-dressing. It was disobedience. Disobedience in a world that demanded women be silent, subordinate, and unseen. And so when they finally had her in chains, their punishment didn't just aim to end her life, it aimed to reassert control over her womanhood. The first weapon: isolation from other women. Joan was not housed in a convent or watched by nuns as canon law required for female prisoners. She was held in a military prison surrounded by male guards with no feminine presence to offer comfort. Safety or dignity. This was not just a breach of church law, it was deliberate. Gendered violence. Those men were not simply there to guard her, they were there to remind her minute by minute of what she was: a girl, a prisoner, a body. Historical records describe her constant fear of rape. She begged the judges repeatedly to be placed under the care of women. She pleaded not for mercy, not for release, but for basic bodily safety. She never got it to protect herself. She continued to wear male clothing, a padded doublet, hose, and tightly bound leggings. That made it harder for men to assault her in that single act of resistance. Her clothing became the most frequently cited evidence in heresy trial. Let that sink in. Jean was accused of sin because she tried not to be raped. During one interrogation, the judges asked her why she continued to wear men's clothes. Her answer was simple: because it is more lawful and suitable that I dress like a man while among men than that I expose myself to danger. They mocked her for it. To them, modesty wasn't virtue, it was defiance, and in Joan's case, defiance was treason. She was offered a deal: abandon your male attire, submit to the authority of the church, admit that your voices were false and you might live. It was a perverse ultimatum: choose femininity and be spared, choose identity and burn. Even her visions were twisted into a gendered accusation. The voices she claimed to hear, St. Catherine, St. Margaret, the Archangel Michael, were dismissed not as divine guidance but female hysteria, at best delusion, at worst witchcraft. A woman hearing voices was not a prophet. She was either mad or possessed. The trial transcripts show how the questions grew increasingly invasive. They asked about her virginity, they asked whether she had ever been with a man, they probed her childhood, her menstruation, her habits of dress. They weren't trying to find truth, they were trying to collapse her sense of self. Joan was no longer being judged as a soldier or a visionary. She was being judged as a woman who had stepped too far out of line, and so day after day her interrogators worked to break her through implication, repetition, and shame. Imagine being 19 years old. You've never had a lover, you've devoted your life to what you believed was a divine calling, and now surrounded by older men, scholars, clergy, you're being asked to justify the existence of your own body. The questions weren't neutral. They were weapons, and Joan, for all her courage, began to falter. Witnesses say her hands trembled during some of the longer sessions. She wept, she prayed aloud in court, she begged not to be left alone at night with the guards. None of it helped to them. She was no longer human, she was a symbol to be disassembled and a woman to be made into an example. Her only crime was power, and power in a woman to the world that held her captive was a heresy all its own. By the time Joan of Arc entered the courtroom in Rouen, her fate had already been decided. What unfolded in those long, cold months of 1431 wasn't a trial in any real sense. It was a performance, a pre-written play staged not to discover truth but to justify it. Killing the court was filled not with impartial judges but hand-picked English sympathizers. At the helm was Bishop Pierre Cosson, a man with more political ambition than pastoral care. He owed his position to the English crown, and he knew that burning Joan would cement his loyalty. The charges, over 70 at first, 70 distinct accusations, each one more absurd than the last: heresy, sorcery, worship of demons, blasphemy, wearing men's clothes, claiming divine voices, disobeying her parents, breaking the commandment to honor church authority. It was a scattered, frantic list thrown together not to pursue justice but to overwhelm her. The sheer Number of charges was the first tactic. Confusion as a form of control. Joan had no lawyer, no advocate, no translator. Despite Latin being the language of the court, she was a teenage peasant girl, barely literate, facing a panel of university-trained theologians and clerical interrogators, most of whom saw her not as a defendant but as a liar, a fraud, a heretic, and most importantly a threat. And still she held her ground. Despite exhaustion, fear, and isolation, Joan's responses were sharp, even brilliant. When asked if she believed she was in a state of grace, a trap designed to ensnare her, she responded, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." It was a theological paradox that silenced the court. They wanted her to stumble. Instead she outmaneuvered them, but brilliance alone could not save her, because this court didn't need truth, it needed a confession. And so they began to shift their strategy from interrogation to psychological pressure. The trial sessions stretched for hours. Joan was frequently deprived of sleep, pulled from her cell at dawn, interrogated until dusk, then returned to a bed she was literally chained to. They brought in doctors to examine her body, searching for signs of witches' marks, a birthmark or blemish they could call satanic. They found nothing, but they kept searching, more interested in spectacle than fact. The interrogations were designed to trap her in contradictions. They asked the same questions, repeatedly worded differently, hoping fatigue would crack her memory. They asked about her visions, if they were dreams, if they were real, if they came at night or day, if they spoke in French or Latin. They asked if she had heard voices since childhood. They demanded she name what the angels looked like, what they wore, what their hair was like. These weren't questions of theology. They were baked, and all the while Joan remained in that same stone cell, alone, shackled, half-starved. There was no one to confide in, no priest to hear her confession, no friend to remind her that she wasn't losing her mind. This was not a trial, it was a siege of the soul. The goal was not to test her innocence, it was to grind her spirit down to the point where she would break herself. And when her interrogators realized she wouldn't crack under theology, they turned to fear. On March 10, 1431, they brought her before a special tribunal. Not in a courtroom, not in her cell, but in a place meant to terrify, the torture chamber. There among the racks, the pulleys, the irons, the tools of physical torment, they made her a simple offer: confess and live, resist and suffer. Joan looked around at the devices designed to tear flesh from bone, at the hooks, at the wheels, at the strappado where the arms were tied behind the back and the body suspended, then dropped to dislocate the shoulders. And they asked her, "Do you fear the instruments of torture?" She answered, "Truly I fear nothing but treason." Still she was shaken, and it's here that the historical record reveals something chilling. She was not physically tortured, not because the court found mercy, but because they didn't need to. The threat of torture, the imagery, the setting, the performance was more effective than any blade. It was terror theater, and it worked. Joan sobbed. She trembled. She swore she would not lie, even to save her life. And so they sent her back to her cell, still unbroken, but now aware of just how far they were willing to go from that moment on. The trial was no longer about guilt or innocence, it was about time, how long she could hold out, and how long they were willing to wait before breaking her completely. Torture in the medieval sense wasn't always about the body. Sometimes it was about what you didn't do, what you made someone believe was about to happen. Sometimes the rack didn't need to turn. The chains didn't need to snap. Bone all That was required was the slow, deliberate promise of pain for Joan of Arc. The attempted torture was its own sentence. The court called it a preliminary examination under duress, but it was nothing short of ritualized terror. March 10, 1431. Joan is brought to a vaulted room beneath the main hall. She is no longer flanked by judges in clerical robes but by executioners. Hooded silent professional before her stands the strappado, the rack and other gleaming metal instruments laid out like surgical tools. This was not a court, this was a stage, and she was the intended audience. Bishop Pierre Cashin, now playing his final hand, informs her, "You will be subjected to these instruments unless you tell the truth." The truth. But what did that mean to them? Her truth had always been simple. She heard voices. She followed them. They led her to battle, to victory, to coronation, to chains. Now they wanted her to say it was all a lie. But Joan didn't confess, not even as the executioners approached, not even as her eyes fell on the ropes that would yank her arms from their sockets, not even as she trembled with exhaustion, hunger and spiritual grief. Witnesses recorded her state of mind. She was pale, her lips quivered, she wept, yes, but she did not fold. And so the judges did something cunning. They paused, they stepped back, not out of mercy but because they understood something terrifying. They didn't need to inflict pain, they only needed to leave her with it. Joan was returned to her cell that day without a single blow, but with every image of violence burned into her mind, and it worked. The girl who had once stood unshaken before kings now lay in a cold stone room, imagining the pull of the rope, the crunch of bone, the fire beneath her feet. Modern psychology calls this anticipatory trauma, the body reliving an assault that hasn't yet occurred, the mind breaking under the pressure of imagined agony. Joan had lived through sieges, sword fights, the chaos of battle. But what awaited her now was worse. Silence, waiting, the knowledge that she could be summoned at any moment, not to answer but to scream. This was psychological torture in its purest form. Not the brutality of action but the brutality of possibility. And they weren't finished. The judges began to visit her more frequently, not to ask questions but to remind her. Subtle lines inserted into conversation. You seem tired. Pain has a way of robbing sleep. You could avoid suffering. Joan just admit the voices were false. There is still time, but not much. This wasn't dialogue, it was a psychological siege. They were building a cage not from iron, but from uncertainty. Would the torturer come tonight? Would she be dragged from her cell again? Would the church really allow this? Had God abandoned her every time Joan closed her eyes? The ropes were waiting. Every prayer was drowned out by the imagined creak of pulleys. Every whisper outside her cell could be the sound of the guard coming to fetch her. They didn't break her with tools, they broke her with time. Eventually her mental defenses began to erode. There are hints in the records, fragments of doubt, half-finished prayers, moments when she wondered aloud whether her voices were silent because she had sinned. It's easy to romanticize Joan as unwavering, but the truth is more tragic. She faltered. She struggled, she feared, and that makes her suffering more real, not less, because she wasn't a statue, she was a girl, and the fear she lived with in those last weeks wasn't abstract, it was tangible, vivid and unrelenting. When people speak of her courage, they often forget this part, the quiet horror of almost being tortured again and again until that fear becomes a second heartbeat. She didn't break under the sword, she broke under anticipation, and that was always the plan.